Okay, excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for coming this morning. It's great to see you all. We've been doing these workshops at SB3C for a number of years. We try to do one every year and introduce some new features in the software and also do demos and or tutorials to kind of introduce people to using the software. And so the first half of the presentation today will focus on an overview of the project and new features. And the second half will be a hands-on tutorial where you'll work through an example with Dr. Steve Moss. So my name is Jeff Weiss. This is Gerard Ateshian from Columbia University and Steve Moss from University of Utah. And we're kind of the main three people that will be here today. I had a couple of my current and former students are here to help out as well. So if we have any issues as you're working through the tutorials, they can help kind of guide you through them. So let me just start with just an overview of the project. So we got started working on this project because, the finite element method was something that was, that continues to be a fundamental way for solving PDEs numerically. And, the tools that were available in biomechanics field were historically not very friendly and not very open. And so they had a combination, people use things like Abacus and ANSYS. And so we can think of them as closed source codes. And they're not, you don't really know what's going on under the hood. Also, there are a lot of these codes that are kind of that are open source. They kind of lack continuous integration and continuous development. And so a lot of times people were having to develop their own custom code. That code didn't always get shared, which is a problem for reproducibility. And so we try to emphasize the ability to, when you publish a paper with some models, you can make those models available and somebody, an end user, can say, I want to reproduce figure 3 in the paper, and they can download the files from the repository and actually run the model and reproduce your results. That's a really important part of open science. And so because there was this lack of open source tools that were tailored to our field, we felt that this was an area that needed to be addressed. And so we started off developing FEBio, which stands for finite elements for biomechanics and biophysics, to be specifically designed for problems in the fields of biomechanics and biophysics. And we started this project around 2005, and it's been continuously funded by NIH since 2007. And it's a collaboration, as I mentioned, between my laboratory at the University of Utah and Professor Ateshian's laboratory at Columbia University. And so just to move on, there's kind of three pillars of the project that we focus on. One is to target the biomechanics and biophysics communities by focusing on features that are important to our users and relevant to the field. So we try to stay in touch with our users, and we also try to stay on top of the literature so that we're staying one step ahead of what people need in order to do their research. And so when you look through the FEBio user manual, or you look through the repository, or you look through some of our knowledge-based materials, what you'll see is that these features that we're developing are features that are being used in cutting-edge research in the field, and they're primarily motivated by our own interpretation of what people need, but also more fundamentally by what users like yourselves tell us. And so we're always very happy to hear from users about what they need for their research or for their development work with FEBio. We also wanted to make sure that FEBio was free and easy to extend. And so a lot of commercial codes, as you know, there's a cost associated with those, and it can be very difficult to extend the codes because you don't really have a full understanding of what's going on under the hood because the source code is not available. They may have means for you to extend it via, user materials or things like that, but a lot of the algorithms are sort of hidden from the user. And finally, one of the things that we found that was often lacking in some of the other products, commercial products, and open source codes that were out there is a lack of thorough documentation and a lack of support and outreach to the community. So we've really tried to emphasize those things over the last 15 years. And we go to conferences, we put on tutorials and workshops. We have a large knowledge base now with all sorts of examples. We have a very large verification suite that users can reference when they want to, for instance, learn about new features. So this project's really taken off far beyond our initial expectations. as of our last grant submission a few months back, there were over 100,000 downloads of FEBio and FEBio Studio. We now have over 20,000 registered users on febio.org. Well over 800 publications have cited or made use of FEBio. And notably, FEBio and FEBio Studio are used as a teaching tool in universities all over the world. And part of the reason that that's been so successful is because we've really endeavored to make the user interface in FEBio Studio very friendly. So I can teach, for instance, in a biomechanics 2 class that has nothing to do with finite elements, and I can provide students with models that are relevant to topics that I'm teaching them in the class. Let's say it's cardiac mechanics function, the role of the fiber orientation distribution in the heart wall in wringing out blood during systole. I can provide them with a model that they can run, query, look at results. I can ask them questions about it. And they don't need to know anything about the finite element method. All they need to do is download the model and run it and follow the homework instructions. And so it's very, very useful, not only for teaching finite elements, but for teaching biomechanics in general. So FEBio has been applied across a wide range of application areas that are represented here at this conference. Obviously soft and hard tissue mechanics are big areas, but I think that, some of the more recent work in our software has focused more on damage modeling and growth and remodeling and mechanobiology. And those areas are well represented now in the software. And of course, you'll see many applications of these types of analyses here at the conference. If you go to the sessions, a lot of people use FEBio in their research. And so, sorry about the slide formatting here, but FEBio has a number of different physics modules for doing different types of analyses. So solid mechanics, fluid structure interaction. This is an example problem just showing a cut through the left ventricle as the ventricle contracts during systole. The center model here is a model of the cervical spine that was put together by my colleague at University of Utah using FEBio from CT data. This is an example, a test problem illustrating fluid structure interaction coupling that Professor Teshian put together. And this problem in the top right here is a fluid dynamics analysis of the carotid artery that was performed in the context of the manuscript that was published on this topic. And so the other nice thing about FEBio is that you can write plugins that integrate with the software and extend the functionality. And so an example from some of the research in my laboratory, we're interested in understanding how the characteristics of the extracellular matrix, for instance, the orientation of collagen fibrils, the density of the collagen, influences the growth of microvessels. And so we've coupled a discrete model of angiogenesis with FEBio, and basically what it does is it queries the properties of the extracellular matrix, and using rules-based growth of the vascular networks, we can predict the orientation changes that would occur in, for instance, an aligned collagen gel versus a collagen gel with a random orientation. And so this is an example using some of the cell growth materials in FEBio, and this is Professor Teshian's research. And so in this case, they were interested in understanding different mechanisms that might be responsible for the growth of cysts in polycystic kidney disease. And so using kind of a systematic approach to investigate a number of different possible mechanical stimuli, they kind of went through and tried them all, figured out which ones would actually produce the type of cyst growth that's observed in this disease. And so this is an example of successful formation. And this shows a quarter symmetry model that illustrates the relative volume change during the growth of the cyst. So there's various ways to model growth in FEBio, and one of the ways is illustrated here. So I think I'll skip over this model for now. Just show some other examples from applications in my laboratory. So Luke is studying the effect of the labrum on chondrolabral mechanics in hips that have femoral acetabular impingement syndrome. So he builds patient-specific models from MRI and CT data, applies patient-specific kinematics, and uses the code to to predict, the contact stresses in acetabular cartilage during activities such as gait and squat. This example is from Luke Timmons' lab, and Professor Timmons was interested in understanding how stents get deployed and simulating that process of the balloon deployment, causing the plastic deformation in the nitinol stent. And so this is a challenging problem because it involves plasticity and a very difficult cost problem, all kind of a snap through behavior. Well, which makes the solution. Control the motion of the valves, and they perform the finite element analysis in FEBio Studio. And the idea here is to predict the closed configuration of the valve. And so this is a challenging contact problem. And so we implemented a new contact algorithm for this. And so there's various metrics of valve function that you can examine from these analyses. And so let me just get past this. So this shows an example of the initial valve closure. So in this case, you can look at it from a couple of different angles. And so one of the things they're interested in here is doing shape enforcement. So this idea is that a lot of times we have some information a priori about what the shape is of our deformed structure. And so in this case, we can run the analysis as a forward model driven by pressure and get the deformed configuration. Let me just run this again. And that's the initial valve closure here. And then we can, since we know where the surface of the valve needs to be, we have a target surface that's illustrated here as yellow, and we can use the shape enforcement feature that's been added into FEBio to ensure that our solution conforms to the target surface. And so during this next step, you see that the surfaces become aligned. And so this idea that we have a priori data that we can bring in, whether it's a surface or image data that our model needs to conform to, is one of the focuses of our new grant. And so one of the other things that we've implemented recently in FEBio Studio is the ability to work with image data within the modeling pipeline. So there are a number of different things that you can now do with image data. Some of the more traditional things that we do is, for instance, import image data and use it to assign.
So Allison mentioned, actually, I think we already showed this, Sean and Allison already showed this slide. There's really a pipeline there doing image.
Thanks. Some of the things that we can do with image data, for instance, are assign material properties. So like you might have micro CT data and you want to use that to map Hounsfield number to Young's modulus. So you can do that type of material assignment pipeline now in FEBio Studio. One of the other things that one of my previous students was working on is the ability to characterize material anisotropy. So you can also bring in image data and calculate the orientation distribution function for the local region of the image. And so then you can take that orientation distribution function and fit it, if you want, to a parametric representation like a ellipsoidal fiber distribution or a von Mises fiber distribution. And then you can use that fiber distribution in constitutive models to define properties of materials, such as the fiber material properties and their distribution, or even things like permeability or diffusivity. And so these are new features that we're just submitting the paper on right now. And so our project kind of has two pieces to it. FEBio is the command line finite element solver. So usually after you build a model, you analyze it with FEBio, and you can run that from the DOS prompt or from the Linux prompt, or you can run it from within the user interface, which is FEBio Studio. So when you download FEBio, you get FEBio Studio and the solver. They all come across at the same time. Okay. And I wanted to just mention that our newest grant was just reviewed recently, and I'll give you an overview of some of the things that we're going to be working on for the next 4 years. So our first aim is focused on physics of thermal fluids, thermoelasticity, and thermoviscoelasticity, and thermoplasticity with heat transfer. And Dr. Ateshian is leading that aim. Our second aim is related to that example that I showed you, where we have a constraint enforcement that we want to do in conjunction with a forward finite element model. So like we want our model to conform to a surface or a curve that we know a priori, or perhaps we have image data that we want to enforce onto the finite element model. Like this mesh has to conform in some way to an object in the image data. And then in aim 3, we're focused on looking at immersed body mechanics in the context of FSI. So the idea that you can have more like a deformable structure that's inside a flow that has its own remeshing going on at the interface between the fluid and the solid. And then finally, we really are going to try to put more emphasis on getting the user community involved in the software development, because it's really gotten to the point where we need your help, to know what you want, and also make it easier for you to do software development yourself. And so this grant was reviewed just recently, and I'm pleased to say that we got a 1 percentile on this one. So I'm pretty sure it's going to get funded. And so we'll be starting on this project for years 17 to 20 in July. So I just wanted to thank all of these people who wrote letters of support for our grant proposal. This is always something that we get a lot of positive feedback on from the reviewers, and the people out there that use our software and like it are kind to us and are always willing to contribute a letter every 4 years when we need to redo this grant. So just want to acknowledge them all. So one other thing I wanted to mention before I turn it over to Professor Ateshian is the model repository in FEBio Studio. So I touched on this earlier, but it's really important that we as scientists make sure that our research can be reproduced. And so on an experimental paper, one of the things that you do to make that happen is you provide the details of all your reagents, right? Any software you might have used for statistical analysis. If you have like genetically modified animals, species, you make those available to people, right? Well, on the modeling and simulation side, we don't do a very good job of making our research reproducible, and it's a real problem. And so I'd just like to encourage everyone to think about that. I mean, if you're writing a manuscript and it includes modeling and simulation, then a reasonably trained scientist should be able to reproduce your research. And so there are a couple of pieces to that. One is hopefully you're using a software that's easily available and maintained. And the other is hopefully the input files for your models are available. And so what we've done in FEBio Studio is tried to make that model availability accessible to you and to others. And so within FEBio Studio, there's a model repository. And one of the things that you can do is that you can define user projects and associate models with those user projects. So as you scroll through here, you'll see a number of different papers. And in each one of these papers, you'll see that it's associated with a DOI. So if you want to, for instance, run one of these models, you can just double click on this, download it from the repository, and it'll open the model in FEBio Studio, and you can run it. And so I think this is really an important and useful feature for people who may be interested in reproducing results in their papers. So think about that when you publish your papers. What we try to do is when we submit a paper for publication, we put all the models on the repository. So not only can the reviewers look at them while they're reviewing the paper, but once the paper is published, then anybody who wants to reproduce figure 3 in the paper can just download that file and reproduce that analysis. Okay. And so try not to be too worried about sharing your science. Making your science available to other people increases the impact of your science, and it leads to more citations and more visibility for your work. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Professor Ateshian. I just want to acknowledge the rest of the team here. So you've met Steve and Gerard, and in the back of the room is Dr. Stephen LaBelle as well. And Michael Heron and Ben Ellis are not here today. I'll stop there and turn it over to Gerard.
So FEBio is a very broad software, but what it's not is it's not a CAD software. So you're not expected to be able to create your geometry within FEBio. So, but to increase the compatibility of FEBio with other CAD software, we've implemented this ability to import step files. So if you have a CAD model, you can import the step file into FEBio. Then we use other people's software to do some of the meshing, right? So I just wanted to highlight the fact that we've improved a little bit our ability to import step files over the last year. And this is an example of a CAD model that was created on a CAD software called FreeCAD. And this happens to be half of a red blood cell. And then when you import this in, how am I gonna do this? Okay, when you import it into FEBio Studio, you can mesh it with NetGen. You don't know that it's NetGen. It doesn't necessarily say so, but when you import the step file, the only way you can mesh it is with NetGen. So when you go to the Mesh tab, it'll end up using NetGen. NetGen has the ability to mesh any geometry using tetrahedral elements. You can either use 4-node tetrahedral elements or 10-node tetrahedral elements. It'll give you that capability. This has been around for a bit of time, so you probably are wondering, why am I bringing this up? More recently, what we realized is you can also import surfaces. So NetGen has these capabilities that keep improving. It's another software developed by other people. We just keep downloading the latest version and try to incorporate it into FEBio. So it turns out you can also import surfaces. And when it comes to meshing surfaces, you can actually do quad dominant meshes, which is not something that normally you would expect. So quad dominant, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's mostly quadrilateral elements and a few triangular elements. And then you can, for example, extrude this geometry to create a solid. So this capability is relatively new, and most of you may not be aware of it, but it only works with surface meshes. You can only do quad dominant, not hex dominant meshes from step files. So not yet, at least. Another thing that's quite useful is we've had users wonder, what if you have a model that's partitioned, like a step file, a CAD model that has a region, when you want to assign different material properties with respect to another region. So it turns out that the import capability that we borrowed from either the NetGen software or Open Cascade, I forget, has this ability to also merge a model. So this is an example of a step file, which consists of a cube and a cylinder. And it was created in this particular case using simple Boolean operations. What happens is when you export it to Step remembers that your geometry started from a cylinder and a box, but by default, it would actually create two separate geometries. So when you mesh them, there's no contiguity of the mesh. The mesh will not be continuous across this interface, for example. So it turns out that there is a capability, and we discovered relatively recently, to merge the two geometries that are imported. And when you merge them, now you have the choice of either meshing this and this separately or this one. So FEBio Studio will let you will automatically import the two and merge the third one. And you can either decide to mesh one of these or the last one. You can either delete the other ones or hide them. And when you do that, for example, if you want to mesh the one that was merged, you can see that the mesh will be contiguous. You can see here that the mesh, the elements are continuous between the cylinder and the box. And of course, you can hide and show whichever one you want. But this is a relatively new capability in FEBio Studio. You may not be aware of it, or you might actually see that there are merged parts, and you may not necessarily understand what they are. So I'm just explaining it. Okay, so now I'm going to switch directions, and I'm going to talk about some other new features. Like I said, every year we give this workshop. We cannot start from scratch and explain all the capabilities of FEBio. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about viscoelasticity theory. And I'm going to remind you that there's been viscoelasticity in FEBio for a long time. This is based on the classical theory of finite viscoelasticity. If you don't know about viscoelasticity, I'm going to give you a crash course. This is going to be theoretical. It's like, I just want you to know everything that I'm explaining here has been implemented in FEBio Studio. So if you have questions, please ask. You don't have to wait until the end. We're not going to open it for questions at the end. Raise your hand if you have a question about what I'm talking about. And if this is way over your head, just be patient. We'll get to more interesting stuff later. If it's not over your head, great, ask questions. So classical viscoelasticity is essentially an implementation of the standard solid, which is two springs and a dashpot. So this would be the Maxwell element. This will be the spring element. And I'll refer to this spring as the series spring because it's in series with a dashpot. And I'll refer to this as the parallel spring. So when you do viscoelasticity theory, you don't want forces, you want stresses, and you want a stress that is invariant to time derivative. It turns out you have to use the second Piola-Kirchhoff stress, not the Cauchy stress, but then internally you convert it to the Cauchy stress, which is the familiar stress that you use in, solid mechanics. So this Cauchy stress here is the sum of the stress in this branch plus the stress in this branch. And the stress in this spring is the same as the stress in this dashpot. In classical viscoelasticity, what you do is you take the sum of these and the stresses in both sides, and you put it equal to this, and you say, the deformation of this spring is equal to the deformation of this dashpot plus the deformation of this spring. And then you can figure out how to write an ordinary differential equation that relates all of this. When you do this, you end up having that this stress, without going through the details, turns out to be given by this integral equation. So this integral equation here is the classical equation that you use in viscoelasticity theory. And basically, it's based on the assumption that the spring and dashpot response is basically given by the exponential response that you see here. The parameter gamma says that the stiffness of this spring is gamma times the stiffness of this spring. That's a fundamental assumption of viscoelasticity. And in order to get this equation from this drawing, you have to assume that the spring is linear and the dashpot is linear. But then, and that's what gives you what is known as the Boltzmann superposition principle. And those of us who are in biomechanics learned about viscoelasticity from Y.C. Feng and his textbooks and his papers. And Y.C. Feng said, you know what? Once you have this integral, you're not really required to use a linear function of the strain for what's going on in the spring. You can make the spring be a nonlinear function of the strain, so it becomes a nonlinear spring. So we call it quasi-linear viscoelasticity. So it's kind of important to understand that quasi-linear viscoelasticity is already breaking the assumptions inherent in this spring and dashpot model, because the differential equation that led to this integral equation was based on the assumption of linearity. But everyone in viscoelasticity theory is very comfortable saying, it's fine, we're going to make the spring nonlinear. However, the dashpot remains a linear function of the velocity, of the rate of strain. As a result of this, the relaxation time, tau, that appears in this exponential has to be a constant. It doesn't depend on the strain. So that's why it's called quasi-linear viscoelasticity. The linear term in quasi-linear comes from the fact that you cannot have a strain-dependent relaxation response. So now, one of the things which is interesting is that, of course, quasi-linear viscoelasticity is a very powerful theory for finite deformation. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for biological tissues. You look at most biological tissues, they're not quasi-linear, they're non-linearly viscoelastic. So other people have proposed different ways to do viscoelasticity. This is just a quick review of the literature, and the modern approach for nonlinear viscoelasticity, which is available also in the biomechanics literature, is called fractional viscoelasticity. I'm not going to go over it. It just means that the differential equation here is not a linear ordinary differential equation. It's a fractional derivative. In FEBio, one of the interesting things that we encounter, so this here explains to you that, how you derive these equations. I'm not going to go over the theory. These are slides that I borrowed from another talk, so you got to be patient with me. But basically, what I wanted to say is this. When you want to do damage mechanics, which is kind of an important aspect of what we do in biomechanics, you want the soft tissue that gets damaged. What if that soft tissue happens to be viscoelastic? So some of the damage criteria that we have in damage theory are based on, for example, the strain energy that's in the material. So what is the strain energy in a viscoelastic material? What's interesting is, though the literature has proposed that there exists one, hardly anyone actually tells you how to calculate it. It turns out it's not trivial. There are additional assumptions that you have to make to calculate the strain energy of a viscoelastic material. However, because we wanted to start implementing damage in viscoelasticity, we needed to do that in FEBio. So I'm going to take you through the process, and you need to understand what we're doing here. Basically, strain energy can only be, formed in the springs. So if you know that the spring is deforming, 1/2 of kx squared would be the strain energy in a spring that deforms by length x. And so the same here. This deformation gradient, the amount of strain here, is the total strain that you're applying, but the strain here is this plus the strain in the dashpot is equal to the total strain. So internally, you have to figure out the relationship between this strain and this strain, but recognizing that the constiv model for this spring is the same as the constiv model for this spring, they only differ by a scale factor of gamma. Okay, so that's the theory. So if you can figure out the strain here, and then you can calculate the strain energy in the spring. So we did this for FEBio on our way to explain how we can do damage mechanics. And here's what we discovered. There are a number of interesting constraints, theoretical constraints. Again, if you're not in the field of finite viscoelasticity, this could be the most boring portion of the presentation. I promise there'll be more interesting and practical things later. But when you do finite deformation theory, you have to recognize that your deformation gradient here is a combination of a rotation and a stretch. So this rotation and the stretch, you can ascribe it to the total deformation gradient. You can always calculate it after you find the solution for the stretch. The question becomes, what is the rotation and the stretch in the deformation gradient of the dashpot and the spring? So my understanding is the viscoelasticity literature is not clear. Some papers propose something, some papers don't. But what I discovered is this. One of the basic assumptions, which is never kind of questioned, is that which one goes first, the dashpot or the spring? Does it matter? Should I be able to flip them? The answer is, of course, I should be able to flip them. But if I flip them, it changes the order of how you multiply these stretch tensors. When you switch the order, it turns out that the only way that you can actually switch the order but not change what's going on is to assume that the deformation gradient here has eigenvectors which are aligned with the deformation gradient here. So the stretch ratio has to have the same eigenvector, so it remains symmetric whether you flip this or you don't flip it. Not only that, therefore, the rotation in this parallel element, or the series element rather, should be the same as the rotation in the parallel. When you do this, it turns out you can calculate the stretch in the elastic spring, and you can calculate this stretch here using a power law that you see here. And internally, that's what we do in FEBio. We solve for this power exponent alpha in order to satisfy some of the constraints, and then we can give you back a strain energy density. This is relatively recent, meaning it's those of you who might be using viscoelastic models in FEBio may not have realized it, but in the past, if you requested to plot the strain energy density in a viscoelastic material, it just returned 0. Now it doesn't return 0 anymore. It returns this calculation. But there is a number of constitutive assumptions inherent in this calculation, so I wanted to share that with you. Okay, all of this is great, except that the problem is, yeah, so the details of this presentation are in this paper. Don't worry about that. Okay, so let's do uniaxial stress relaxation. For example, you have a spring. The parallel spring has a stiffness of 1 megapascal. The series spring, the one that's on the Maxwell element, also has a stiffness of 1 megapascal, which is equivalent to saying gamma is equal to 1. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I pick a Poisson ratio of 0, and I have only one exponential relaxation time of 2 seconds. And I do a stress relaxation test. So I ramp up the time, the strain, in 1 second, and I let the analysis relax for the remaining 9 seconds. And this is the response that we get for the stress, that's the green curve, and for the strain energy density, which is going to be the blue curve. So the strain energy density previously would have been 0. So when you load the material, it rises to a peak value, and then it relaxes to the elastic response, the strain energy and the elastic response. So this is a relatively new feature in FEBio that didn't exist before. Okay, so this is very nice. The only problem is, like I said earlier, most biological tissues are not linearly viscoelastic or quasi-linearly viscoelastic. It turns out most biological tissues are non-linearly viscoelastic. So in parallel to this development, we also developed a reactive viscoelasticity framework. And it's reactive in the sense that we assume that there are strong bonds, such as covalent bonds. When you load them, they give you the elastic response. And you have weak bonds, such as hydrogen bonds, which break and reform in a stress-free state. So the reactive process is, in response to loading, these weak bonds break and reform, and there's a time-dependent, reformation rate and breaking rate, because it's all reactions in chemistry are time-dependent. So when you do this, you actually, okay, so I explained this. You have strong bonds, you have weak bonds. And what's interesting is, of course, when we created this formulation, we wanted to make sure that we're not inventing something completely from scratch. And we were able to show that in the limit of infinitesimal strains and linear behavior, it reduces exactly to linear viscoelasticity and therefore quasi-linear viscoelasticity. So, but however, it can model nonlinear viscoelasticity because you can make this reaction be strain dependent. You can say, oh, the reaction rate depends on how much strain you prescribe, in which case you can have that the relaxation time depends on the amount of strain. So that's a pretty powerful, approach. So I want you to know that whereas we've had this reactive viscoelasticity framework in FEBio for a while, last year we published a paper where we showed that we can run it numerically much more efficiently than in the past. It's not easy to run these numerically, but that's what we did. We made it more efficient. And not only that, so it's not as efficient as running a quasi-linear viscoelastic model because we wanted to be able to use relaxation functions that are not exponential. Even if you assume strain-independent relaxation, we didn't want just exponential functions. And the only method that you can run quasi-linear viscoelasticity efficiently numerically is to assume that the relaxation is exponential, in which case you have to use a Prony series. So we wanted to avoid these limitations. So in a reactive viscoelasticity model material, you have to specify a material associated with the strong bonds, a material associated with the weak bonds, and you have to specify a reduced relaxation function. A reduced relaxation function means that it's equal to 1 at time 0, and it goes to 0 as time goes to infinity. And optionally, to do another form of nonlinear viscoelasticity, which I'm going to mention in a second, you can specify a weak bond recruitment function. So this is what it would look like in FEBio Studio. This is the elastic material. For example, you can make it Neo-Hookean. You can also make the weak bond material Neo-Hookean. In this particular case, I'm trying to reproduce exactly the viscoelastic model I showed you in the previous slide. So when we do this, we have the ability to do continuum relaxation spectra, which you cannot necessarily do easily with a discrete relaxation spectrum like the Prony series. The Prony series is this discrete relaxation spectra because you're using exponentials and the sum of exponentials. You have a discrete number. In FEBio, the maximum that you can do is 6 terms in the Prony series, which is more than you need for most cases, but that's a discrete relaxation spectra. However, in the viscoelasticity theory, continuous relaxation spectra have also been described, and in theory can also be used in quasi-linear viscoelasticity, but in practice, they're not numerically efficient. However, our reactive viscoelasticity framework lets you do a continuous relaxation spectrum. For example, Y.C. Feng in 1972 proposed this particular relaxation function, and so I'm going to illustrate it to you. The nice thing about a continuum spectrum relaxation function is it doesn't necessarily reach steady state quickly. So you have a much more realistic response that kind of looks more like experimental data. And in the context of reactive viscoelasticity, in the beginning, when you load it with the step strain, both the weak bonds and the strong bonds are loaded, but immediately the weak bonds start to break over time and they reform in a stress-free state. But then if you load again at a second time, the ones that reform start to break. The ones that were breaking before continue to break. You see, it's a time-dependent reaction. So when you do this, then you realize that, oh, reactive viscoelasticity is not so difficult to understand. It's not like fractional viscoelasticity. I'm not trying to criticize fractional viscoelasticity. Anyway, but that's what it is. So all of these are available to us. Sorry, my slides are not well done. But so remember earlier, I had a quasi-linear viscoelastic material with a modulus of 1 megapascal and gamma equal to 1, which means that the Maxwell element spring had the same stiffness as the parallel spring. So you can reproduce this in a reactive viscoelastic framework by making the modulus of the strong bonds and the modulus of the weak bonds the same. And in this particular case, we picked a very simple relaxation function. What you see is what I told you before. The stress is exactly the same, those two green colors between quasi-linear viscoelasticity and reactive viscoelasticity. The greens are on top of each other. You cannot tell them apart. However, what's interesting is the strain energy density is different. It's not, their model, they are, after all, different constitutive models, different approaches. So the strain energy density is not the same, but since strain energy density was never explained in classical viscoelasticity, it's not like we're violating anything. I'm showing you that we get the exact same stress response, which is all that was required to satisfy the equivalence between the two theories. Now, I can do this with uniaxial tensile cyclical creep, same material model, same comparison. Once again, the stresses are exactly the same between the quasi-linear viscoelasticity and the reactive viscoelasticity case. This is in the case of infinitesimal strains. And what you see here is the typical, what should we call it? In viscoelasticity, when you load and unload the material, not hysteresis, the preconditioning, right? Preconditioning, where in the beginning you see, oh, large strain, but over time, the cycles seem to fall on top of each other. But if you plot the strain energy density, once again, it's not the same. And what you notice here, which is interesting, is that when the stress goes to zero, in the reactive viscoelasticity case, the strain energy density doesn't go to zero, but in the quasi-linear viscoelasticity, it does. So why is that? Well, you have two springs. When you unload the quasi-linear viscoelastic model, both springs go to zero strain, so the strain energy density will be zero. Whereas in the reactive viscoelastic model, when you load and you unload, it's the total stress that goes to zero, the stress in the strong bonds plus the stress in the weak bonds, but it's not necessary that they're both equal to zero. There's no requirement. One of them is still relaxing. The bonds are still breaking. So it turns out that the strain energy density doesn't go back to zero in the reactive viscoelasticity case. Okay, so, and like I said, one of the advantages of using the reactive viscoelasticity framework is that you can actually have non-exponential relaxation spectra, continuous spectra, for example, a power law, which is much more commonly in agreement with experimental data for tissue biomechanics than an exponential law. So in this particular case, you know, we actually use this power law for cartilage subjected to tension. I went back to the data from my student that we published in 2006, and we refitted it. We fitted the strain response at 10% strain, the stress response. We got the orange curve. And from that, we got these material properties. This is for the strong bonds, this is for the weak bonds, and this is the relaxation function. And I thought that I'm going to get strain-dependent viscoelasticity in this case, but it turned out that after I fitted the orange curve, I could predict the other curves at 8%, 6%, 4%, 2% strain without changing the material properties. So in effect, cartilage in tension exhibits quasi-linear viscoelasticity because the relaxation response is not strain-dependent, but it's not exponential either. So you wouldn't be able to model it in FEBio or any other software without coming to, you know, the reactive viscoelasticity framework, because other software will use an exponential relaxation time. Now, what is, yes? Yeah.
So about material models for the big strong models.
Yeah.
You have in the example you show that they are the same. Right?
Correct.
Can you change?
Yes. Correct. So in quasi-linear viscoelasticity, there are no strong bonds, weak bonds. The two springs must have the same constitutive model, just they can differ at most by a scale factor of gamma. In reactive viscoelasticity, you can have a completely different constitutive model for the strong bonds and the weak bonds. Yesterday, my student, Kim Krupa, who's sitting in the audience, presented results for unconfined compression of type 2 collagen, the viscoelastic response, and showed that actually the strong bond response had a different shape than the weak bond response. It was the same constitutive model, but one of them had completely different material properties than the other. So they weren't just, you know, they didn't just differ by scale factor. So that is definitely the case. The results she showed yesterday were much more impressive than the results I'm going to show you today, but it's fine. So weak bonds. So when you load the material, you might expose new locations where these hydrogen bonds can form. Kim had beautiful slides. I didn't copy them from her, but if you watch her presentation, you might remember. But in effect, it translates into this. If there's no weak bond recruitment, you get the response that you see with the blue curve. So when you load the first time and you let it relax, if you have the same amount of hydrogen bonds available, the second time that you load, the stress will only rise by a similar amount to the first time you loaded because you still have more or less the same number of weak bonds available. If, however, you say now at this higher amount of strain, there's more weak bonds available, then the stress can rise higher. And that also is often seen in experimental data. So in this particular case, we also used a continuum spectrum relaxation function, which was also based on Fung's, constitutive model. And finally, when we fitted data from my colleague, Nadine Shaheen at Columbia, this is the intervertebral disc. This is part of the paper that we published. Basically, in her case, we had to have both bond recruitment and strain-dependent permeability. So the bond recruitment is shown with the blue curve here. So initially, you have whatever weak bonds is, has a ratio of 1, but with increasing strain, the weak bonds increase by a factor of 5. There's 5 times more weak bonds, so you can capture this higher peak. But at the same time, the relaxation time seemed to be dependent on the strain. And when we looked at the relaxation time, it turns out that at higher strains, it went down. The relaxation time went down. So this is an interesting example of a highly nonlinear viscoelastic response. We're still not able to capture this peak, but that's a whole lot better that you can do with, exponential stress relaxation. Okay, anyway, so that's the end of my presentation on viscoelasticity. And then briefly, I'm going to talk about, so we said, Jeff explained that we're going to introduce thermofluids, thermoplasticity, thermoviscoelasticity, et cetera, in the next 4 years. We started already with the thermofluids, and I'm going to give a presentation this afternoon on this, so I just don't want to steal the thunder from my presentation. But basically, when you do, so already in FEBio, we're solving for the fluid dilatation, which is the volume change, and the fluid velocity. So if you do just CFD, you solve these 2 equations, and you solve for JF and VF. But you have a constitutive relation that relates the pressure to the dilatation. But then if you want to add the energy equation to do thermofluids, this is the energy equation. You have the viscous stresses in the fluid will cause some amount of dissipation. And if the pressure depends on temperature, then there's also going to be a source of heat other than the divergence of the heat flux and other external sources of heat. When you do this, then in the thermofluids approach, you use the Galerkin, formulation, the weak form. And I'm not going to go over those details here. And this is an example where you have a fluid that's coming in with a higher temperature at the inlet. So we start with a temperature of 50 degrees Celsius and a gauge pressure of 0, but then we're going to apply 60 degrees for the fluid that's coming in. We're also going to apply a fluid pressure here that's going to drive the fluid that has a high temperature across. This will create a high Peclet number, and high Peclet number flows, whether it's in solute transport or in thermofluid transport, are very hard to solve numerically, except that somehow we figured out how to do it in FEBio. So I'll show you the results. So this is the fluid velocity when you apply a pressure of 1 Pascal. The pressure of 1 Pascal is like a constant force on the fluid. Force is mass times acceleration, so the fluid is accelerating. So the fluid velocity keeps increasing over time. Initially, the fluid velocity is not parabolic, but eventually it becomes parabolic as the color contours suggest, and the arrows become bigger because of the magnitude of the flow. Then you have this. And now let's look at the temperature of the fluid that's coming in. And you notice, oh my goodness, there is a very high temperature gradient, but it's being convected very fast. It turns out that the Peclet number here is on the order of 4,500, which is a high number. And yet somehow we're able to solve it without any difficulty. Those exit boundary conditions are killer. Okay, I'm going to skip those details. Anyway, then we can do free convection. Free convection is when, due to gravity and buoyancy forces, so we're going to heat up the surface of this cylinder, if you want, and there's a fluid here, which actually is air treated as an ideal gas. So the temperature of, the air initially is 15 degrees Celsius, but then we're going to raise the temperature of the cylinder to 65 degrees Celsius. Then we're going to watch how it's going to locally heat the fluid, and due to local buoyancy forces, the fluid is going to start moving upward, and then the temperature is also going to convect upward. So when we do this simulation, you will notice that the fluid velocity is increasing like you see. So very nice patterns of fluid flow. This is the fluid magnitude. And you know, so this analysis ran for the equivalent of 60 seconds, right? This is quite impressive that it can run for so long. This happens to be open top boundary conditions. So we're saying that the temperature at the top is 15 degrees Celsius, but the fluid can escape. And if you look at the actual temperature distribution, you can see what those of you who are young enough that your parents used to smoke and you could watch the cigarette smoke coming out, you know, it's like a similar phenomenon. I remember as a kid, that's what I used to do. I was fascinated by how the smoke went up, but now it turns out you can simulate this in FEBio. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. If you have questions, feel free to ask, but then Steve is going to take over next and talk to you about other practical developments. Then we'll take a break. And then we'll come back. How long is the break going to be? 10, 15 minutes? 10-minute break. You can go to the bathroom, drink coffee, whatever you want to do, then come back and we'll do a hands-on workshop where he's going to use files from that repository that Jeff told you about. So if you're connected to the internet, you can download these files now. But in any case, Steve will explain all of that to you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so what I wanted to talk about was this fourth aim that Jeff briefly mentioned in this next grant or this grant renewal was this idea of basically making FEBio more what I call programmable. And the idea is that we want to give more tools and features to the user to help control what exactly FEBio does or FEBio Studio does, and provide ways for you to kind of script your pipelines and kind of interact your models more through commands and through scripts. And the main motivation for this is that over the years we've learned that people want to use FEBio for very complicated things, and sometimes they just need something very specific, and then we can add a button for that in FEBio Studio, and we're happy to do that. But you know, you can imagine if we keep doing that for everybody, then FEBio Studio is going to have a whole bunch of buttons that are only going to be useful for one or two people. And I think a better approach here is basically give you the tools to add buttons that you can use for your own specific needs. And so the goal is here to make FEBio and FEBio Studio more programmable. And so there's a couple things that we're working on. All of this is still very much in development. So I will show a few examples, but they'll be very simple at this point. So, but some of the things that we would like to be able to do is improve the support for FEBio plugins. So FEBio plugins are pieces of code, libraries actually, that you can write by yourself and then link to FEBio. And that's one way for you to kind of customize what FEBio does. So FEBio Studio has some support for FEBio plugins, but we want to expand that and make it more user-friendly. So one of the things we want to do is we want to be able to generate much of the template code that you will need to write when you're creating plugins. We want to be able to create that template code for you, integrate some of the build steps for your plugins into FEBio Studio. And we're also going to be working on a plugin manager, just like we now have that model repository. We're going to have also a repository for plugins or Python scripts or any other kind of tools that you can use with FEBio Studio. So that's one thing. There's another thing we're working on is a command line interface or doing any kind of scripting. And it's kind of funny because when we started, you know, back in the old day, if you remember when we had post view and preview, so post view had a command line interface, and then we thought, nah, no one's going to use this. We threw it out. And then after many years, people were wondering, well, we want a command line interface, so we're bringing that back. And then another thing we're going to be working on is a Python interface. This is something we have been working on and off in between other kind of more important projects, but I think we're really going to bring that to the forefront and develop that further so that you can have Python integration within FEBio Studio. So we're going to go over these things a little bit in more detail, but I'm going to show you FEBio Studio 3. So, okay, so the first thing, talk a bit more about this idea of generating plugins. So what we're going to have here, we have here a tool that says create FEBio plugin. So you'll just give it a name. You'll be able to select the module, which basically means like what type of physics you want to do. You know, the solid, the fluids, the heat transfer module. Then you can select what kind of plugin type that you want to generate, like a constitutive model or some special type of boundary load, or you want to create additional plot variables for outputs. And then you specify a path where you want to do this, and then you click on create. And so what will FEBio Studio will do is will generate a bunch of templated code for you. Well, not templated, but just the template of that plugin code. It'll have all the functions you'll have to implement. The functions will be empty because doesn't know what you're trying to do, but it'll have most of the boilerplate code done for you. It'll generate a CMake file that you can use to easily build your plugin as well. And so the next step will be actually integrate some buttons that allow you to call CMake or even the compiler from within FEBio Studio. So the other thing is something we haven't put a lot of work on it, but like I said, we'll have this repository inside FEBio Studio where you can see which plugins you have installed in FEBio Studio. Then you'll be able to browse and look for plugins, see what other people have done. That can sometimes be useful also as a starting point for your own work. Then you can download these plugins, and what the nice thing is that the plugins that we will offer, the plugins that we will offer will be managed by us. So one of the challenges we now have with plugins is that plugins work with a certain version of FEBio, but then if we update something in FEBio, we may accidentally break your plugin, right? And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be managing all the plugins that we provide through this interface on our end, so they will always be up to date and they will work with whatever version you have installed on your computer. Okay, so then we have our command line interface. So the command window here will allow you to type commands. This thing is kind of in my way here, sorry. So you'll be able to use, I don't know why that just happened. You can create new models. You can open files. You can create boxes or any kind of primitives, and you can provide the parameters on the command line, and we'll create it all for you. And as you can see, it'll record all these commands that you're executing so that you can save them, and then you can actually create. Sorry, Zoom's getting in my way here. You can compile all these commands in a file. Let me just open that here. So what that looks like. Okay, so you can put all these commands in a file, and then you can run that entire script. So let me show that quickly. Just need to grab this path. Oh, let me close this. Like that, and it'll just run through the commands and set up your entire FEBio model. So in this case, what we did here was just create a new model, added a box, added a material, assign the material to the box, selected a surface, and then add a zero displacement boundary condition on the surface, right? So the commands will allow you to kind of script these things. Basically, the idea is that for every button that you have in FEBio or in FEBio Studio, you'll have a command that can do that through the command interface as well. Okay, so next up, oh yes, the Python interface. So the Python interface will allow you to basically write Python scripts and integrate them within the UE of FEBio Studio. And so let me just grab an example. Let's grab this one. Okay, so as you can see, so these are all tools that were implemented in the Python scripts. And let me show you what it looks like. So you'll basically, you can define some functions that will actually do what you want to do, and then you define these tools basically that will then be integrated in the FEBio Studio user interface. And so this one, for example, is another tool that makes a box. So there you go. Another way to generate a box. So we'll have lots of ways for generating boxes in FEBio Studio. So, okay, let's see what's next. Oh yeah, so another interesting feature that we'll be bringing is some code that I've had for a very long time, but I finally decided to integrate it in FEBio Studio. And these are things what I like to call FEBio apps. So the idea is, let me just load one quickly. The idea is that you can create these simple GUI-based applications that you can then load in FEBio Studio, and eventually also will be able to load without FEBio Studio, basically as standalone applications, where you basically provide a simple user interface to your FEBio model. Okay, so there is an FEBio model behind the scenes here, and then I've generated this simple script. So again, it's based on a simple script here, an XML format that's that's your FEBio file here, and then these are just the UI elements, and then you can load that in FEBio Studio, and you can solve that. And I think, applications for these are kind of in classes. You can use this as little demonstrations. You can also use these as kind of an interface to running optimization problems and looking at the fit, how well the fit fits the data as the model is being run. You can also create some interactive demos. Let me show you this one. It's open. So this one uses, has a 3D view that you can interact with. And then you can change these parameters. Run it again and see the effects of the parameter change. The one I really wanted to show was this interactive one where you can start running. So this is just a beam bending with a pressure loads, and then you can change the pressure as the model is running and show kind of an interactive demo of what happens when you change the pressure on a beam. So these are kind of fun little things that that you can do with these FEBio apps.
You want to stay there?
And then last,
Yeah.
what I want to
No,
show
until
is
11:30, and then whatever you decide.
a feature that I wanted in the code for a very long time, and that is
After
basically
11:30,
a
as
way to
like
kind
you
of run
plan or any
FEBio,
plans, whatever.
but with a user interface. Instead of having it on a command line, you can run this through this FEBio monitor, where you will see a live update every time FEBio Studio, as it's working on the solution. And the main reason I wanted to do this is for debugging problems. So you can run through your model, you can step through your model, one user iteration at a time. You can see the changes, you can see where elements are inverting, where problems are occurring. You have that immediate live feedback. You don't have to like run the model, look at the plot file, change anything. So now you can have this all live in here. And it has a few other cool features. I think it's got all the parameters here that are a load curve are attached to it. And you can see all these values. It has also this matrix inspector, which allows you to inspect the entire stiffness matrix. Sometimes, maybe not for big problems like this, but for small problems, it can be useful just to look at what is going on at the stiffness matrix level. So, but here you can see what the stiffness matrix looks like in a variety of representations. You can do some analysis on the stiffness matrix, look at the condition number, for instance, that might be interesting. So there's a lot of features here that are going to help you debug your models and kind of understand what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so that's the last feature I wanted to show. So next up will be the interactive tutorial, and I will take a quick break here. But before we do, I just want to remind you that the files that we will be using will be available or are available on the FEBio repository. So if you haven't had a chance to download, this might be a good time. And you can find them under Workshops, SB3C 2024. Now there's a bunch of files under there, but the only one we really need is the very first one, the one that says step 1. So we'll be starting from that file, and hopefully if everything goes well, you don't need any of the other files. They're just there as backups for, if you fall behind or for whatever reason it's not working for you, you can catch up with some of these other files. The last one, the step 5, for instance, contains the complete model ready to run. And then the zip file here at the very bottom, that is the plot file. In case for whatever reason, again, you're unable to run the model on your laptop, you can just download that zip file, and then we can look at the analysis together. So, but before we do, okay, welcome back everyone. Let's get started with the second part of this workshop, and that is the interactive tutorial. Before we do so though, I want to get an idea of how many people are new to FEBio and FEBio Studio. So by raise of hands, how many new users are here? Okay, quite a few. That is good to know. Well, hopefully this will be a very good first experience for you guys. So, which reminded me also to bring up something I forgot to mention earlier, and that is how do you find help and support for FEBio? So the main place to start is the FEBio website, which is febio.org. And there's a few different places to go here. So the knowledge base is where we collect all our tutorials, our workshop information, all our manuals, user manuals and theory manuals, developer's manual for those who want to do plugin development. So if you want to get started with learning FEBio and FEBio Studio, the knowledge place is probably a good place to start. Aside from that, we also have a forum, the FEBio forums, and that is if you have any questions or you find anything odd about FEBio that you think might be a bug, this would be a good place to ask those questions. So these forums are monitored by all the developers here, and we try to respond as quickly as we can to any kind of questions that you may have. So if you have any kind of questions, just hop on the forums and just reach out to us there. The other thing I want to point out is that FEBio and FEBio Studio is fully open source, so you can download the software from GitHub, from the FEBio software project. And so we have an FEBio repository, an FEBio Studio repository, and a few other ones. But these are the two main ones. And there's also, well, once you log in, there's also, oh, actually, let me go here. So there is an issues tab here. So if you find any bugs that, you know, are pretty clear as a bug in the software, or if you have any feature requests, things you would like to see in FEBio and FEBio Studio, so you can hop on GitHub and post an issue on the issues page. And so we also try to monitor these pages and provide any feedback as well. Okay, so I just wanted to pass that information on. And then now let's get started with the tutorial. So, okay, so since I'm gonna close this, I have FEBio Studio 3 here, but I hope you had a chance to install FEBio Studio 2.7, which is our latest stable release, and it's got a bunch of new features that I will be highlighting as we come across them in our tutorial. So the first thing I want to point out here is when FEBio Studio start, you get this welcome page with a few quick links to some of the menu items, you know, to get you started quickly. There's also a recent files list here that you can find, where you can find all the files you worked on recently, and some quick links for opening them as well. So let me get organized here. Tutorial. Okay, so hopefully you'll also had a chance to download at least the step 1 file that we'll be starting from. So go ahead and open that file. So one way of opening it is just dragging and dropping it onto the welcome screen, and that should open up the file. You can also do file open. If you've downloaded it from the repository, then to open it, you can double click on it. You can also right click on the file and click the download option, and then once you've downloaded the file, there should also be, let me just download it quickly. So if you right click on the file, you can also go to the file location if you want to have your Windows Explorer open at that location as well. Okay. All right, so hopefully everyone is able to load this file. And we're going to be doing something that's a little bit more ambitious than I usually do on these workshops. In these workshops, I usually start from very simple boxes, cylinders, things we create. But for this one, I want to do something a little bit more ambitious and put together a model that actually is something useful in the context of biomechanics. And we'll see how it goes. But this is a simplified model of the open knee repository. So I don't know if you're familiar with the open knee project, but if you go to SimTK, you can find the open knee project there, and they distribute these knee models, these complete knee models that have all the important component to it. And what I just grabbed one of these models and I stripped it down to what we see here. So the only thing that I retained here were the cartilage layers, the menisci, and then the MCL and the bones. Okay, so the goal is, what we're going to do is we're going to basically put a load on the femur, and then we're going to apply a rotation on that femur while keeping the tibia fixed. So in order to do that, we'll have to, you know, deal with contact. We'll have to deal with constitutive models, assigning dual models to the different parts, assigning boundary conditions. We have rigid bodies here. So it's a fairly complicated model that we'll be building, but hopefully take it one step at a time. Hopefully everything will go well. Let me grab my cheat sheets here as well. Okay, so let's get started with step 1. Materials. So when we do a final analysis, one of the things that our final element solver needs to know is, well, what material does each part represent? So in this case, we're going to be using a few different types of materials. We're going to have some rigid bodies for the bones. We're going to have some isotropic material for the menisci, and we'll have a transversely isotropic material for the MCL. Okay? Now, just to be clear, I'm not going for super realism here. So these are just examples of how you would model this. I'm not saying that this is the way you should model a knee. Probably this is not the way you should model a knee, but these are just some illustrations on how to set up the model in FEBio Studio. Okay, so let's get started. So find your model panel, which I think should be on the left side if you start from a fresh installation. And the model panel basically gives you an overview of everything that is in your model, right? So there's basically two parts to it. There's the geometry that defines or that collects all the objects and whatnot that you have in your model. So in this case, we only have one, which is the entire model, it's one object here. And then the second part here is all the fine elements, stuff that you would need to define your model. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some materials. So go ahead and right click on the materials item here and select the add material item. Oh, by the way, we have a few helpers here. So we have Luke and Steven in the very back. So if you have any questions, raise your hand and they'll come and find you and help you out. Okay, so let's get started with the bones. Okay, so bones in FEBio are modeled using a rigid body. So you can type in the filter rigid body to kind of limit it, and then select the rigid body, and then click OK, add it. Then if you look at the bottom here, you'll have some information, and one of the things you can do is you can rename this material, and let's call that femur. Okay, so you'll see that this rigid body is just represented here with this icon in the middle, and we haven't told FEBio Studio yet which part of our model actually is associated or assigned to that rigid body. And the way we do that is we're going to select the femur part of this and assign that to this material. So the way we do that is go to your part selection tool, which is the blue sphere on your main toolbar at the top, kind of in the middle of the screen. That's right there. So click on that. And so this also allows me to kind of show this new feature, which was implemented in this version 2.7, which is the part highlighting. Like if you go over these parts, you'll see that they light up. So that's a new feature if you use FEBio Studio before. So highlight the femur part and then click on it with your left mouse button to select it. Okay. Selected items usually turn blue. Now, another thing I want to point out is that selections now have these darker blue lines, which kind of help contour lines here, which kind of help kind of see the boundary a little bit better. So that's also kind of a new thing. Now, go back to your model panel and scroll down till you can see the selection box. Once you see the selection box, click on the green plus button to assign that part to that material. Okay, so now if you click anywhere else in the screen to clear your selection, you'll now see that your femur has been given a color. Okay, you can change that color. So on the info panel here, next to the name, there is also a button that allows you to change the color. So we want to make that look a little bit more like a bone, something like that. Okay, everybody still with me? Great. A couple useful shortcuts. If you press the M shortcut, you can toggle the mesh lines on and off. And again, if you use FEBio Studio before, you may notice that the mesh lines actually look a little better than they used to in previous versions. So in previous versions, especially when you have small or very fine mesh, the mesh lines began kind of to dominate the rendering, and it became kind of just an ugly mess at some point. So now the mesh lines look much better in this version. So that's one shortcut. The other one is the Z shortcut, which toggles these black edge lines. So sometimes that's also useful. And the last shortcut that can be useful is the W for the wireframe, which toggles between the solid rendering and just a wire rendering. Okay. Okay, so that's the femur. So now we'll do the exact same thing for the tibia. So go back to the materials. In fact, we'll use a different way here. Go to physics menu. So the physics menu lists also all the menu items for adding different physics components to your model. So we'll go to add material. Again, we'll add another rigid body. Sorry, my zoom things keep getting in the way here. Okay, so back on our model panel under the info pane here, just change the name to tibia. Then make sure the part selection tool is still active here, and then select the tibia part. Back on the model panel, scroll down to the selection pane, and then click the green plus button to assign it. Okay. So we're going to make one more simplification in this model, something that you would not do if you were to do a real knee model, and that is we're going to assign the cartilage layers also to the rigid bone. Okay, so cartilage obviously is not rigid, but just to keep the model relatively small when we run it, we're going to assign these cartilage layers to the rigid parts as well. Okay, so the process how to do that is the same thing. So let's go to the let's select the femoral cartilage first. Then make sure the femur material is selected here. And then again, click the green plus button on the selection button to add that to this material. Okay, so now we have both the femur as well as the femoral cartilage assigned to this rigid body. Let's do the same thing for the tibia cartilage layers. So there's two of them. So you can select one, and then you hold down your shift button when you select the other one. So holding down the shift button will add to your selection. With those parts selected, make sure the tibia material is selected in your model viewer. Scroll down to the selection pane and click plus. Okay, there we go. So now we have our rigid body done. Next, let's do the menisci. So for the menisci, we're going to use, oh, someone has a question there. For the menisci, we're going to use a deformable material. So let's go ahead, right click on the material item here, select add material. Let me know if I'm going too fast or if you need to slow down. Who's still with me? By raise of hands. Okay, we've lost a few victims. Okay. So remember, if you fall behind, there are these backup files in the repository that you can find to catch back up. So we're still on step 1 at this point. But if you load the step 2 file, that will have all the materials assigned. Okay, so I'll remind you of that in a second once we're done with this. Okay, so now we're going to use a deformal constitutive model. And the Mio-Hookean material is one that is often used for a lot of different purposes, often as a first order approximation, if you will, of the constitutive behavior. So this is an isotropic material. So we assume that the behavior is the same in every direction. So once you find it, click OK. And then it will be added to the model viewer here. And this time we do have to enter some material parameters. So for the Young's modulus, oh, I forgot to do something. So as you can see here, there are no units here. They're just numbers, right? So FEBio Studio can show units if you want to, which is often helpful. So let's turn that on. Go to the Tools menu at the top. Select Options. Then find the Units item in the left panel. And then that's right. So on Mac, it's a little different. For the units, I think I chose the millimeter Newton seconds. So let's use that one. Right, so when you can see at the bottom here, the derived units are pressure, which also means our stresses, and our Young's moduli and other stress-like parameters will be in megapascals, and our forces will be in newtons. Okay, so now if you look back to the material here, you'll see now these units have shown up, and that will help us kind of keep track of the units of all our parameters. So for the Young's modulus, we will select 100 megapascal. And then for the Poisson's ratio, we'll just do 0.3. Okay, although we've added the material to the model, we haven't told FEBio Studio which part the material we want to assign to. So let's do that next. So hopefully that process is now very familiar. So make sure again that the part selection tool is active here on the top. Then click on one of the menisci and then shift click on the other. We'll select them both. Scroll down here till you see the selection pane and then click the green plus button. Right, if all goes well, we should now have a purple menisci. Okay, so that leaves just the MCL. For the MCL, we're going to use a different constitutive model. So go back to the materials, add material, and this time in the filter here, start typing trans space iso, and we're going to be using a transversely isotropic Mooney-Rivlin material. Okay, so this is a transversely isotropic, so that means it has one preferred direction. So think of a very fibrous material, so it'll have a different response when you pull or push in the direction of the fibers versus the plane perpendicular to the fibers. Okay, so click OK. For the material parameters, so by the way, you can, if you click on these panes here, you can collapse them, and clicking on them again will expand them again. If you're running out of real estate space here, you can kind of click on these things to get a bit more room. Now, for the material parameters, I'm going to type this in first, and then I'll leave this open so you can copy this. So for the bulk modulus, we'll do 397, C1 144. C3.57. C4 40. Oops. 48. 476.1. 1.063. Okay, so I'll leave this open here. So the parameters here are on the bottom. So go ahead and copy those. The parameters that are not listed here will remain 0 or whatever the default value is. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to copy those values. Everybody ready? What's that? No, I haven't. I can share them later, but um, they're not anywhere at this point. Okay. Oh, another useful shortcut here is the escape key. So if if it looks like your selection isn't working, just keep pressing escape key until it starts to work. So okay, so this brings us to the end of step 1. If I've completely lost you, you can catch back up by loading the step 2 file. So again, in the repository. Yeah, that's step 2. So that's what we do in the next step. Yep. So everything we've done up to this point will be ready for you in the step 2 file. And okay, okay. So yeah, so if we go back to our model panel here and we select our material. Oh, we didn't sign it yet. Sorry. So go ahead and click on the MCL and then in the selection, click the green plus button to actually assign that material to that part. Okay. So one of the things you see here in the material properties is that there's just this fiber option. And so like I said, this material is a transversely isotropic material, which means it has a preferred direction. And we call it fibers because usually in a biological material, it represents, some fiber distribution. But what we still need to do is we need to define the orientation of that fiber distribution. Now, there are a lot of ways we can do this. And we can, if you click on this, you'll see, and then select the select option, you'll see there's a whole bunch of them. Don't select any of them yet. But you can specify using angle criteria, using cylindrical coordinate systems, using mathematical expressions, spherical coordinate system. If it's just a single direction you want, you can just choose vector. So that's a constant vector. You just specify that direction directly. Okay, the one that we'll be using will be a map. But again, don't select it yet. We'll come back to this once we're ready. So go ahead and click cancel. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a tool that will generate the fibers on this part following the geometry of that fiber. Okay, so that can sometimes be useful if you have a complex geometry and you want to define some fiber distribution that kind of follows it. So I'll show you a tool that you can use to do that. Yeah.
The plate below the beamer, I'll see part of the beamer.
This parts? Yes. So that is the cartilage of the femur. And again, cartilage isn't rigid, but we're doing this to reduce the computational complexity of our model, so it actually runs on our laptops. Okay, so we're going to use a tool here, but before we do that, let's hide everything that we don't need. So we want just the MCL. And there's a couple ways you can hide parts. The easiest way is if you go to the toolbar below the graphics view here, you'll see this button with this red circle and this icon, this arrow icon. If you select that, so you've turned on the select and hide mode, which means that everything you select will be hidden automatically. So if I select on the femur, it will be selected. Okay, so go ahead and do that and just click on everything that is not MCL. Okay, once you have that, remember we have our Z shortcut key to get rid of all these black lines. And then we do want our mesh visible. So let's select the M shortcut key to bring that back. Then make sure to turn that off. Otherwise, we're going to run into some strange issues. Yes, again, make sure this option is off once you've hidden all these parts. On the main toolbar, select the green icon here. So we're done with selecting parts. So we're going to go back to our green object here and then make sure that it is selected. So you should be able to see this white frame around it. Okay, and then we are ready to go to our tool. So on the build panel, it's not letting me make this bigger. That's a problem. You gotta be kidding me.
So just under the classroom, please evacuate to come back.
Oh. Okay, let's continue. Okay, so find your build panel, which should be on the right side, and then go to the Tools tab on the build panel. And then finally, click on the Fiber Generator tool. By the way, you can detach these tools, these boxes, from wherever they're docked, and you can move them to a location that you prefer. So I can dock it on this left-hand side if I wanted to. All right. So the way the Fiber Generator tool works is basically it solves kind of a mini filament, what's it called? Well, I guess let's call it a simple heat transfer problem. So basically what you do is you provide some temperatures in certain parts of the surface, and then it'll solve the temperature distribution for the model, and then it'll generate fibers by taking the gradient of that temperature distribution, right? So if we make one end of the MCL cold, so to speak, and the other end we make it hot, so we know the temperature will go from hot to cold, and then we take the gradient, then you can kind of see how that would follow the shape of the geometry a bit. Okay, so that's what we're basically going to do. Now, we need to select parts of our surface here, and there are a few different ways, and I want to show a few of those. So the first one is, let's make sure that our face selection tool here is active, and again, make sure this green button is selected here. Otherwise, you might see some strange things. So once the green is selected, select on the red face, and now we can select facets on our surface. Okay, so there's the first way of selecting facets. So you click on a facet. If you want to add to that selection, you can shift click, and but you can see that that's probably going to take us a while to get through this entire surface here. So we're trying to select this top surface here. Another useful shortcut is the I key. So the I key will kind of get rid of these tags, right? So we can choose how much information we want to see here. So these are the face numbers. These are the face numbers and the node numbers that they connect to. But in this case, we just want to see our selection, so we don't need anything. Okay, a second way of selecting is with our brush. So you'll see here this brush tool. So go ahead and click on that. And you should now get this this circle. I don't know if you can see it very well on the screen here, but you see there's a circle around my mouse, which it's kind of like my brush size, and you can make that brush size bigger or smaller by holding down the Alt button. And I'm not sure how this would work on Mac, but on Windows it's the Alt button, and then the scroll on your mouse. Now, if you shift click on your part, you can go ahead and select. And select that. Okay, hopefully that worked. So unselect is controlled. If you hold down the controlled key, and then you can use the brush to unselect. On Windows as well, you have to use the shifts to use the brush. Okay, once we're done with the brush, make sure to unselect it. Otherwise, again, we'll have some weird behavior, and hopefully your selection will look like mine. So we'll have these top faces selected. So hopefully that worked. Back to our fiber generator panel here. So we'll assign a temperature of 1 to that and click Add. Okay, so now that selection will be given a temperature of 1 in our false heat transfer problem here. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing on the bottom. So first, click somewhere outside of your graphics view to clear that selection. And then I'm moving down to the bottom here by holding down my Alt button and my right mouse key. Okay, so we can do the same thing on the bottom side here, but I'll show you another way of making a selection. So there's also a button here called Select Connected. So right left of this 30 here, there's a button. If you click that, what's going to happen now, if you select anywhere on your model, it's going to select all the faces that have a surface normal that is within 30 degrees of the surface normal of the facet that you clicked on. Now, as you can see, that kind of bled through the boundary that we wanted. So let's set that to 10. Set that angle criteria to 10 degrees, and let's do that again. Okay, so that gives us a bit better selection. Not quite, but we can use our shift selection to kind of grow this, and so that it kind of looks like this. Okay, so that's another way of selecting some facets on your surfaces. Okay, so for this, we'll give it a temperature value of 0. It doesn't really matter what value you give it as long as it's not a 1, because we have already used 1. So we want to create a temperature distribution, so you can use it 0, you can use 2, you can use whatever you want. Just don't use 1. Okay, so we're almost ready. Is everybody with me?
I'm just getting the selection, which is not or not something else. What is it? This really specified.
Oh, for the fiber selection, we'll use map. Yeah, but we'll get to that. So we'll get to that in a minute. I think he was asking about the material. Oh, yeah, tools, and then fiber generator. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so once you've selected it, you choose a value and then you click add. So you should have 2 selections here with 2 different values. And by the way, you can change these values after the fact as well. If you just double click on it, you can change these values. You can't change the selections yet, unfortunately. So hopefully that went well. So the selection on the top, I just selected these faces. Okay. And using that angle criteria, by the way, you can select this whole top surface with 1 click. So that would be the easiest way to select that top surface. Not yet. No. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully everybody is with me. So go back to your fiber generator tool. We have to make a few changes here. So the material, make sure that is set to, I forgot to give this a name, but I think it's material 4. And then for the max iterations, we'll set that to 2000. Then make sure that you check the option that says generate map. And then we'll give this map a name. So once you check that option, there is a field that shows up next to it where you can type a name. And so we'll type fibers. And once you're ready, go ahead and click apply. This will take a couple seconds. But hopefully you'll see converged as well. If you're completely lost, don't worry, you can use one of the backup files to catch back up. So
Like that circle, you're gonna do something for like favorite. I haven't had this in red. Then when I do the fiber generator thing, it does this one.
yeah,
Add it to your Nancy.
yeah. Yep. Okay, I'll give everyone a minute to catch up. Sure.
I really don't know.
Okay, let's continue. So now that we've generated this this fiber map, so if you go back to your model viewer, you'll see here that under mesh data, something has appeared, namely your map, right? So your map, your fibers is now a map that is available for use wherever you want it. So in this case, we want to use that as our fiber property or component of our transversely isotropic material. In order to do that, go back to our material, and while I'm here, I'm going to change this to MCL. So scroll back under your material properties until you find the fiber property, and then under select, click and select the map option here. And then you'll get a map parameter here, and then you can type the name of that map in our case, which is fibers. Okay, so now we can look at the results. And the way we do that here is I'm going to press escape until my box turns white again. So if I right click on my graphics view, I get a little context menu from which I can select some things. Under physics, I can select show fibers, which activates the fiber visualization tool. And if we adjust these parameters a little bit so we can see this better, you can kind of see indeed that our fibers are running along our MCL just like we wanted to. Okay, so the default color code, by the way, is the orientation, which uses a red, green, blue RGB color coding. So blue means it's pointing along the z-axis, which is indeed the axis in which our MCL is pointing. So it looks that worked fine. Okay, so that looks good. So with that, we have completed step 2. And let me just double check. Yep. And we can move on to step 3. Okay. Yeah, so again, if you're completely lost, this is a good time to load the step 3 file from that repository so you can catch up and continue. Hopefully we'll make it on time to the end here. Analyze those? Sure. So what I did was I right-clicked here to get my context menu, physics, show fibers. Okay, so that gives you the fiber visualization tool, and then you can change the scale factor. If you change the line style to shaded lines, you get like a 3D representation, and then you can also change the line width. Yeah, that's another way to get to that same menu. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So step 3. So we've done all our materials, but now we have to decide our boundary conditions, right? So we need to say how much load are we going to apply, which parts are going to be fixed, which parts can move. So these things need to be set up to boundary conditions and constraints. So go back to our model panel. Let me see, what are we going to do first? Okay, so the first thing we're going to, let's bring everything back. So first of all, so if you go back to your geometry item here in your model tree and you right click on the objects item, you can say show all objects. Okay, so everything is back now. We have our white selection box. Good. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to attach the bottom of the menisci to our tibia rigid body. So right now, nothing is connected to anything. Okay, so if we run this model now, it would just completely fall apart because nothing is connected to anything. So we have to be very explicit which parts are connected to which parts. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take the bottom surfaces of these menisci and we're going to attach them to the tibia. Okay, so go to your model viewer and then under boundary conditions, right click on that and say add nodal BC. Select rigid and then click OK. Under the properties, select the just click on the select and then choose tibia. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to select the bottom surfaces of the menisci and assign that to this boundary condition. Now, it's a little tricky to get to the bottom of these menisci. So what we're going to do first is we're going to hide some of the parts here. And the easiest way to do that is actually by going to our materials, select tibia, right click on that, and then say hide parts. So now the tibia parts are hidden. We can see the bottom of the menisci. Next, click on the select surface option here. So right next to the sphere, we have a square. So click on that. So that will allow us to select the surfaces. And now select the two bottom surfaces of the menisci. So again, you click on the first one, and then you shift click on the second one. With those two surfaces selected, we go back to our model here. We scroll back down till we see our selection. Oh, make sure your boundary condition is selected here. And then click plus. Okay, so now these two surfaces are attached to the tibia. Okay. All right, so next up is, okay, we're going to do another one of those. Actually, we're going to do two more of those. We're going to attach our MCL to the rigid bodies as well. Okay, so we need two of those because the bottom side will attach to the tibia, whereas the top side will attach to the femur. So first, I'll hide the femur parts so we can actually have better access to those facets. And again, the easiest way to do it is go to materials, select the femur, right click, hide parts. Okay, so let's add another boundary condition. So right click on the boundary conditions here, select add nodal BC, select rigid, click OK. And just so we can keep track of these things, I'm going to give this a name. So this will be MCL to femur. Okay, so now we have to select again these facets here because we don't have a well-defined surface for this MCL here. So we have to select these facets again. We have to use that same process that we just saw. So hopefully that will go smoothly. But first, make sure to go back to your object selection here, and then your face selection tool on the bottom. In this case, we'll just use our select connected because that's the fastest option here. So make sure this button is checked as well. And then make sure the value here is set to 10. So again, those are the 10 degrees that we use as a criteria for selecting our facets. Okay, so the femur is the top part here. So if you set that up correctly, then you should be able to select that entire surface with just a single click. We go back to our model site here and scroll down to your selection and click on the green plus item. Okay, so now we've attached the top part of that MCL to the femur. So make sure you clear this selection so we don't accidentally assign that to the tibia as well. So navigate to the bottom part here, and again, I'm using my Alt button and my right mouse button to kind of pan my view. Okay, same process. Click on boundary conditions, right click, add nodal BC, widgets. Click OK. I'm going to rename this MCL tibia. Now we got to select the bottom faces here. Again, we can use our same process. And then we assign them with the plus button here. Give you a minute to catch up. By a raise of hands, how many people are still with me? 1, 2. Okay, so if I've lost you, you can go ahead and open the next step file, step 4, to be back where we are. So step 4 will have, let's see. Yeah, so step 4 will have all these boundary conditions that we're adding now. All right, so we still have quite a few boundary conditions to go through. Given the time and the fact that quite a few people seem to have fallen behind, why don't we just go ahead and open step 5, and then I'll just talk you through the boundary conditions instead of having to actually add them. Okay, so why don't you, I'll give you a minute. So download that step 5 file and go ahead and open that. All right, so step 5 is our completed model, but let me walk you a little bit through some of the things um, that are important to note. So first of all, notice that there is this contact definition. If you turn on this, which is another new feature here, this selection highlighting, it will show you which surfaces are assigned to that contact. And so contact usually involves two surfaces. One we call the primary surface, and that's the surface on which most of the computations are done. And then there is the secondary surface, which is used for measuring distances and gaps and things like that. So in this case, the primary surfaces are the blue ones. You can only see the outline here since they kind of overlap. But basically, the top of the menisci are the primary surfaces, and then the purple one, which is, remember, it's a rigid cartilage, is in this case the secondary surface one. So we also added a bunch of rigid constraints. So the rigid constraints are the equivalent of boundary conditions for rigid bodies. The rigid bodies have different ways of prescribing the motions and the constraints than on these rigid bodies. And so we have, in this case, we'll have 3 different constraints. Here we'll have constraints that fix the rigid body. So the tibia in this case will be held completely fixed. And you can see that if you select, for instance, the rigid constraint 1, if you look at the properties, you see all these checkboxes means that it's fixed for that degree of freedom. The rigid body has 6 degrees of freedom, so we see 6 checkboxes here. So our tibia cannot move. So for our femur, it's a bit more complicated. So the femur, so there are 2 steps here. Let me explain this first, right? So we have 2 steps. Well, the initial step is always there. It's not a special step. It's just where you put all your boundary conditions and loads that remain persistent throughout the entire analysis. Okay, so any boundary conditions that is defined in the individual steps will only be active during that step, right? So for instance, we have here a rigid fixed constraint, which will only be active here during this first step, in which case we have everything prescribed except the z displacement, because the z displacement in this case here is our loading direction. And what we did here is we applied a 10 Newton load to our femur. So we do want our rigid body to move in that direction. So that's why this degree of freedom was kept open. Which reminds me, there's this new feature that was added. If you right click on the steps item here and select the step viewer, so you get an overview of all the loads, boundary conditions, and rigid constraints that are applied in your model, as well in which step they are active. Okay, so in this case, you can see that, so anything you assign to the initial step will remain active throughout the entire analysis. So these first 5 or 6 boundary conditions that are green in both the loading and the rotation step were assigned to the initial condition, so they will remain active in both steps, whereas these other ones you can see in which constraints, in which step that they are active. Okay, so that's a useful tool to kind of get an overview of your boundary conditions and in which steps they remain active. Load controller. So load controller is an important concept in FEBio Studio and FEBio. So basically, it's a function that you attach to a parameter to make it time dependent. So anything that you want to make time dependent in FEBio, you do that by assigning a load curve or a load controller to it. So in this case, so if you look, for instance, let's go find our rigid force. So if you scroll down to the properties, you'll see here that there is this curve icon next to our value. And if you kind of hover over that, it'll tell you which load controller was assigned to that parameter. Okay. Another way of seeing that information is through the curve editor, which is an important tool in FEBio Studio. So there is a shortcut here, but you can also get to it through Tools, Curve Editor. And again, this is another way of seeing which load controller is assigned to which parameter. So if you click on the filter here and scroll all the way to the bottom, select load curves. So these are all the parameters that have load curves assigned. And if you click on them, you can see how that these parameters will change as a function of time. Okay. So let's see. Oh yeah, outputs. So FEBio will generate by default two files. One is called the plot file and one is called the log file. Okay, so the plot file is a binary file that will basically contain all the basically the solution to your problem, right? So now you have to tell FEBio what it wants to record. Okay, so there are some default fields that will automatically be added for different kinds of analysis. So FEBio or FEBio Studio was clever enough to add some contact parameters and some fiber parameters. Actually, do you see the fiber parameters? You do, right? Okay, I couldn't remember if I added those or if they were there by default. But in any case, if you want to change anything, if you want to remove an item from this list or you want to add one to this list, you can click on Edit Plot Variables to bring open that dialog box. And then here you have the very long list of all the plot variables that you can choose. Now, of course, not all of them will be relevant for what you are doing, but you can use the filter here to find one. So let's see what other contact parameters we have. If we type in contact, this will show all the contact relevant parameters. Okay, so the same thing with the log file here. So if it's the same dialog box, just a different tab. So we've added a bunch of information for our rigid bodies, like forces, moments, positions, rotations. Now, all that stuff is actually already stored in the plot file, so you don't need to explicitly add that to the log file unless you have a good reason to. Let's say you have some script that you want to process this data from. So that's one way you can get that data into a text file that is easier to process. And then let me check my notes here, make sure I didn't miss anything. But I think we're pretty much ready to try to run this model. Okay. All right. The moment of truth has come. Let's try to run this model. So to run the model, you can either use the shortcut here. So this red kind of exploded cube is it's the FEBio icon. So if you click on that, or you go to FEBio and then choose the first Run FEBio option, you'll get a dialog box with some settings you can change. So you can set the name of a job. You can change the working directory, and notice that by default, FEBio Studio will always add this jobs folders where it will put the plot and the log file. Then you can choose the launch configuration. So the default launch configuration actually means that you're running it through FEBio Studio. So FEBio Studio has FEBio built in it, so it can run FEBio files. And that's what you do by default. But you can also have, you can add custom launch configurations if you want to, where you can specify the location of your FEBio executable. Let's say you want to run this as a separate process or with a different version of FEBio that this version of FEBio Studio is built with. You can do that by creating these custom launch configurations. So you can also create launch configurations to, remote clusters. So if you want to run this on a cluster, for instance, you can do that through FEBio Studio. So you have to set up one of these Q or Q scripts, and then you can run that on the cluster, assuming that FEBio is installed on that cluster, of course. But we'll stick to our default and just run it locally from within FEBio Studio. There are some advanced options, so we're not going to use these, but they are useful often for debugging your model. So if you have a problem with your model, you want to try to find out what's going on, you can turn on the debug mode. What that will do is it will dump a lot more information to your plot and your log files, so they can get very big. So do be careful with that, especially for bigger models. Now, this is something that the FEBio monitor will be more useful for in future versions of FEBio Studio, but for now, using this debug modes, you can use kind of analyze your models. You can customize configuration files, tasks names. If you want to do something else besides just run the model, if you want to run optimization of something, you can do all that stuff with these advanced settings. But in this case, we'll just keep it simple. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this model. And then this will probably take a couple minutes, so we can take a quick little break if you want to. And then hopefully, if all goes well, by the end of this, it will say normal termination. And then we can go ahead and open the plot file and look at the results. Okay, so again, this will probably take a couple minutes, so take a quick break if you want to. So this is your log file, basically. So at the end of this run, you will have all this information that was printed on the screen here available in your log file. You can review that after the fact. Now, of course, it will remain open in FEBio Studio here as well. So once this is done, you can scroll up and look through that information as well. But I just want you to be aware that this is being saved in a file as well. We're almost there. So on the top Windows title bar, you can see how far we've progressed. We're at about 75%. Hopefully it ran for you as well. Who was able to run it and get a normal termination? All right, quite a few people. That makes me happy. Did anybody get error terminations? Or still waiting on the results? Still waiting. Okay. Okay, so just want to tell you about this dialog box here, because this is also kind of a new feature. In previous versions, you just get a prompt that says normal termination or error termination, but now you get this dialog box, which basically collects all the warnings and error messages that happened during the run of this analysis. All right, so this can often be useful to kind of review, did this model run well or not? And so the most common problem that we're seeing here is that the problem is diverging. This is not or doesn't necessarily have to be an issue. Basically, that means that the residual increased a little bit instead of decreased. And that can happen when, in contact, when suddenly there is more loading because things are starting to contact, that can increase the loading and that can throw the residual off. And it's probably what's happening here, why we're getting these warning messages. We do have one error, which is a negative Jacobian, which is something that you'll probably see a lot. It's a very common problem in FEBio, not necessarily FEBio, in nonlinear finite analysis. Basically, what happened is during one of the intermediate states that FEBio stumbled on, elements were inverted. So elements basically turned inside out. And at that point, the solution becomes non-physical, obviously, so FEBio cannot proceed anymore. So what it then does, it stops the analysis, it decreases the time step size, and then tries again. Okay, and in this case, it looks like it was able to get past these negative Jacobians. Well, I guess there was only one time step where this happens. but it was able to get past that using that recovery strategy. Okay, so all in all, this model ran pretty good. It had about, I think, 50,000 equations. We ran for about 20 time steps, I think. So, you know, not a small problem anymore, not big, but for a tutorial, definitely a bit more ambitious than what we usually try. So, but it looks like it ran pretty good, all things considered. So go ahead. Hopefully it finished for you as well. Who's still waiting on their runs? Nobody? Okay, good. So go ahead and click open results. If for whatever reason your model didn't run, remember that plot file is also available in that repository as that zip file. Okay, so let me turn off the lines here. And then, okay. All right, so we've opened the plot file, which contains the results of our analysis. So the model looks, of course, the same. But what we see here on the bottom, we see our timeline. And our timeline are all the discrete points in time for which FEBio solved this model. So we can click on any one of them to see what our model looks like, or we can step through them using the animation button here. So on the top, on the main toolbar here, we have this play button. If you click on that, FEBio Studio will just step through the model. And you can see what we actually did here. So first, in the first step, which goes from time 0 to time 1, so about halfway in the analysis, we applied a 10 Newton load on the femur. And then in the second step, we provided a 10 degree, I think, rotation on the femur. So now we can look at some interesting metrics, but first let's go ahead and hide these rigid bodies because there's not a lot of information that we have on these rigid bodies. And we can do that here. Note that our model panel was replaced by our post panel, and that now there's this material tab where we can click on this eye icon to hide the different parts. Okay, so these are the deformable parts. And now we can actually look at some interesting data. So let's look, for instance, for the stress. So on the top bar, you have this drop down box here that shows all the data that's in this plot file. And let's look at something, for instance, the stress and then the effective stress. So that's often a interesting measure that we look at to see where the stress is occurring. And as you can see, it's kind of spotty. And so this is where the contact is happening. So the contact, so we applied a fairly small load, so we don't have a lot of places where our contact had to be enforced. And because our mesh is relatively coarse for this kind of spotty contact, we get these high spots where the contact is being enforced. And that's where the high stresses will be. Okay, we can also look at the MCL. And so one of the things we can do is we can take the menisci, for instance, and we can disable it so that their values are not affected by our, I'll call it, say if we want to look at just the stress in the MCL, we can do that by deactivating the menisci, and now we can see that we have some stress development in our MCL. Okay. Let's take a look at how our fibers changed as a result of this motion. And we can do that by adding a vector plot, right? So these three arrows here, this icon with the three arrows, we click on that. And then we go back to our view here on our post panel. You'll see a vector plot was added. Under the data field, we can select which vector field that we want to plot. So in this case, let's just look at the fiber vectors. And you can kind of see it's the MCL is kind of in the way here. So what we'll do is, instead of hiding it, we can also change its transparency. So go back to the Material tab, click on the MCL, and then just make it transparent by just dragging that. So you can click on that, and then you can drag that to make it more transparent. And that helps us see these fibers better. So now if we click on the animation, we can kind of see how that these fibers are moving as a result of the loading that we applied. We can give these fibers some color. So go back to the view and select the vector plot. So under glyph color, we can change that, for instance, to orientation. So here we get again that red, green, blue color coding that defines the color of our fiber. We can also look at the fiber length. Oh, I was sorry, I was confused. It's right. So it's the bottom color bar here that is being used here, not this one. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so you can add, many different kinds of plots here. We're not going to go through all of them, but you can visualize tensor fields. You can create isosurface plots. You can do slice plots where we'll slice through your model and show contour plots on each of the slices. For fluid analysis, these last three can be useful. So you can visualize the streamlines, I mean. You can do a particle flow plot where you can see particles move through the fluids. You can have a volume flow, which is kind of like a 3D visualization of the flow as kind of a density fields, kind of like a volume rendering of the flow, if you will. And so one more thing, we're getting to the end here, but I just want to make sure I want to point out one more thing that's kind of useful. Let me unhide my MCL. Okay, so what I wanted to show you is you can actually see the individual values of an element or a node or a facet by selecting it and then go to post new graph here. And then you can see how that the value actually changes for that particular element, right? And so here you can see that during the first phase, which was the loading phase, there was not a lot of stress in that element. But once we started rotating the femur, stress in that element increased significantly. Okay, and then you can do that for different elements. You can add different elements at the same time if you want to make comparisons. You can change the value here if you want to look at something else. And so this is one of the ways. So you can copy that to the clipboard, paste it in your Excel or wherever you want it, and then you can do any post analysis from that. So okay, I'll probably leave it at this. So we've kind of barely scratched the surface on doing post analysis. Now I want to remind you that we have our knowledge base here with a lot of tutorials, including kind of an intro tutorial that will walk you through setting up a model, running it in FEBio, and looking at some analysis. So basically similar to what we did here, but using a much simpler model. Let's see, what is it? Oh yeah, just a simple beam bending. So if you're new to FEBio, and FEBio Studio. Of course, I hope that tutorial was useful, but if you need, more information on how to get started, like this is the place to be. Walk through these tutorials. And then, if you have any questions, you're always happy to reach out to us on the forum or even via email if that's more convenient. Just let us know. We're always happy to help. And so with that, I'll stop it.